The subject we're going to talk about today is narrative history. History as presented in a narrative manner. Narrative history has been an activity, and an important activity, since ancient times. By narrative history we mean the shaping and the presenting of an agenda-driven narrative of personal, territorial or communal activity, history. People map out the world in order to see where they fit into it, in order to understand themselves better. And in the same way, they map out history in order to locate themselves, to understand their own place in the great picture of what humanity is all about. And of course, since our confidence in our own importance within this picture is crucial to our sense of understanding, people want to read a history in a way which allows them to see themselves differently, to see themselves more positively as a result of what they learn. Now, in the Middle Ages it was no different. People wanted a construction of their history which they could feel comfortable with. And so they wrote books about it and they read books about it, and these books we call chronicles. It's perhaps a little bit cheeky of me that today I took the title, What is a Chronicle? Because some of you will know that that, of course, was the title of a very important paper, a seminal paper indeed, by David Dumble, which reopened the whole question of genre definitions in medieval historiography. Actually, it's not my intention today to talk about that. I'm not going to take that debate further or think about genre as such. But I have been thinking a lot about the way in which we, in literary studies, which is the angle that I come to this from as a literary scholar, the way in which we conceptualize chronicles. And today I want to take a slightly different tack on that debate. My starting point was the thought that while we scholars are arguing about technical definitions, the words that we are defining are actually also ordinary English words. And so I became interested in the question, what do these words mean to ordinary users of the language? What answer will you get if you ask the proverbial man in the street, what is a chronicle? And in fact, you can do this not just with chronicle, you can do this with any of the words which we throw about in understanding technical definitions. Take a simpler one. What is a novel? Ask any literary scholar what a novel is. You're going to get an answer that focuses on abstract thought, like text or narrative. If you ask somebody who has never studied literature, you're going to get a different answer. You're going to get a much more concrete answer, one that uses the word book. A novel is a book. A novel is a thing you can buy in a bookshop. And this focus on the physical object, that is interesting. Same if you ask what's an atlas, what's an encyclopedia, what's a hymnal, what are annals, what is a chronicle? For most people, the answer is that they're books. If you ask children, if they have a concept at all, it will be gloriously physical. Now, I suppose in one sense, you could say that the more abstract, more sophisticated definitions of the scholars, they're an example of the greater achievement that we can get through the reflective processes of scholarship, without a doubt. But I can't help wondering if we possibly lose something, if we lose touch of the sensual delight in the touchable, holdable, smellable book. Here we have a book. Here we have a chronicle, Dutch chronicle, in its original binding, and it's a beautiful thing to hold. Now, we've got librarians and codicologists in the room today, and to them, I'm prepared to bet this all sounds pretty obvious. But for us in literary scholarship, it's something we keep having to remind ourselves of. So I came to Leiden wondering what difference it would make to the way that I understand chronicles if I focus much more on their physicality. Can we attempt a typology of chronicles based not on the text, but on the way in which those texts work within the volume. Is it possible to write a history of Chronicles from the perspective of readers and users, rather than of authors, so that we take as our landmarks not the great authors, the Bedes and the Jeffreys and the Froissarts, but rather the end products, the paper and parchment monuments? Well, for that, you need a sample group of manuscripts to look at. And 300 or so Chronicle manuscripts in Leiden's special collections are an ideal cross-section. So my project, generously supported by the Scaliger Fellowship and by the Brill Fellowship, was to come here and look at these 300 manuscripts and see what kind of direction I could get if I started taking that actually quite large corpus, but nevertheless a tiny proportion of the manuscript tradition in the world. If I take that and see what I can learn from looking at that corpus. Now, it's still in early days, and I don't know whether I've really gained any new insights or not, but I've certainly had a lot of fun. I've had a wonderful time looking through these manuscripts and reflecting on the intellectual and physical experience of using them. And so I'd like to share a few of these manuscripts with you, show you some pretty pictures, and talk a little bit about the way that these are working as physical books, and perhaps the way that readers respond to them. If we are going to attempt a typology of the physical chronicle, the most obvious place to start, you would think, is with the single work that fills the space between the bindings, the single volume chronicle, or the single chronicle volume. The text is the book. Now, I say that's the most obvious place. I mean, it's the most obvious place for us, because that's our 21st century norm. Actually, this was a minority situation in the Middle Ages. Only about a quarter of the chronicles I have studied fall into the category where you can say you hold a book and it contains exactly one chronicle. But there are some very beautiful examples. So let's start by looking at a couple of these and just seeing what we find in them. Here we have a French manuscript of a French work, the Chronique de la Tréson et Mort de Richard II, Roi d'Angleterre. Richard II of England, as you all know, was a rather unfortunate king. He was deposed by Henry Bolingbroke and locked up, and then when his supporters tried to re-establish his power, Henry realised this is a bit dangerous having him locked up, so Richard was done away with. It is believed that they just locked the door, threw away the key, and he starved to death in February 1400. Well, across the water in France, his supporters, gathered around his queen, were keen to rouse a reaction against Bolingbroke, and in the attempt to mobilise opposition, one little project which was undertaken was the writing of this chronicle. It tells of the reign of Richard, but especially it tells of the treason against him, and in quite horrified and indignant terms discusses how this dreadful man, Henry, has rebelled against God's chosen king and murdered him. This is what I was mentioning earlier about chronicles being agenda-driven. They're not very often just neutral views of history. They normally want to argue for something or present something. They've got a point of view, very often a political point of view, that they want to push. And in this case, it is very clear. This is a propaganda piece, quite clearly. There are 37 manuscripts, and this one here is not the earliest, it's not the most important, but from my point of view, it's very interesting because it clearly was used. When you open it up and look through it, you see the signs that people have been using it. It's, you see from its original concept, it's a nicely illustrated book, nicely written with pictures all the way through. That's only the case where you're expecting wealthier readers, and that tells you immediately what kind of setting that this was written for. But as you look through it, you find lots of notes, and opposite this fine first page that you've got here, you can see on the other side already notes by readers. If we turn back a page, you would find a double page before that, which have got scribblings by people who've used it as you go through it all the way through. There are marginalia, and some of it is some of it's just graffiti, but definite sign that this book was in the hands of students. And then at the back there are a couple of free pages, and somebody in those free pages has painted some pictures. Now these are not the same. This is not the same artist that we had with the picture program that was part of the text. This is something later. You have to turn your head on the side to see it. Sorry, maybe I should have turned the photograph around for you. What we've got here is George and the dragon, and up in the castle. In the Middle Ages, they weren't too worried about a little bit of anachronism. Up in the back castle, we've got Richard and his queen looking down, watching George slaying the dragon. Here, the Chronicle has a very convenient physical form. This is a chronicle that you can hold, that you can use, you can distribute it, you can pass it on to the next person that you want to pass this message on to. And this volume is a participant, an active participant in the political events of the period. Let's take another example. This is quite different. It's a representational manuscript. It's luscious, it's expensive. It's clearly a legitimizing status symbol for a ruling house, and it's one of the most valuable pieces in the library in Leiden. Enguerrand de Montrelet wrote in the mid-15th century a long chronicle covering French history during his lifetime. It starts in 1400 and runs through to 1444. Now this period is obviously a tense period because it's the second half of the 100 Years' War. And as you know, the 100 Years' War was a war between England and France, in which other participants were also involved intermittently. The House of Burgundy, for example, was involved sometimes in the English side, sometimes in the French side. And Enguerrand is an adherent of the House of Burgundy. And he wrote this, actually he wrote it on his own initiative. It doesn't seem to have been commissioned, but he wrote it to present to Philip the Good, the Duke of Burgundy. Now, this manuscript is one of the later ones. This manuscript is actually about 50 years later. And since I'm focusing on readers and users, it's not the original setting of authorship that interests me at the moment, but the fact that 50 years later, this manuscript was produced. It was produced in Belgium, possibly in Bruges, around about 1495. At that time, Bruges was part of the territories of Valois Burgundy, and it was commissioned, we know, by Engelbert of Nassau. Now, Engelbert was a famous patron of the arts. He was actually one of the last patrons of illuminated manuscripts in the Low Countries. He was also a member of the Knights of the Burgundian Golden Fleece, and that was an order of knights that had been founded by, guess what, Philip the Good. So we have a very clear connection between the original situation of authorship and the situation of manuscript creation. 50 years later, somebody else from the same party wants a manuscript of this and has it produced in this luscious illustrated form. And this, again, is an example of a very strongly agenda-driven chronicle. It justifies the Burgundian stance in the wars, including all of their switching of allegiances, fact that they arrested Joan of Arc and handed her over to the English, and you can still be called Philip the Good. How was this to be read? Well, there aren't any marks of ownership. It was far too expensive a manuscript for users to graffiti all over the place. But typically we would imagine it lying open on display like other symbols of wealth, waiting to be consulted by officials looking for arguments to support their position. The thing to remember here is that agenda, this word which in Chronicle studies keeps coming back, this agenda, is not only relevant at the point of writing, it's relevant at the point of reading as well. Ask yourself, who reads a political tract? I mean, who really reads it? Somebody's in the street passing out literature for the Conservative Party, and you get one of these things in your hand. If you support the Conservative Party and you like them, you might read it. If you support Labour, you're probably going to put it in the bin. Right? Political tracts are normally read by the people who already believe what the author wants to say. They want to see themselves validated in what they're reading. The chronicler knows that. And if a chronicle has an agenda, then it's like a political tract. And the chronicler, certainly he would love to convert his enemies, but actually he knows perfectly well what he's really writing for. He's writing to arm his friends. And the reader comes to the text with that in mind. One more example of a single volume chronicle. Now, this is Livy. If Livy had a political agenda, and he did, it's not really particularly relevant anymore by the 15th century. And this raises a question, of course. Am I not cheating when I stand here and show you Livy and talk about medieval chronicles? Is Livy medieval? Of course not. He's a classical Roman historian. And obviously, if we're thinking textually, this is something completely different. But my point today is I don't want to think textually. I want to think bibliocentrically. And this book is a history book made towards the end of the Middle Ages. And I think that it belongs in exactly the same category as any other history book that they were making towards the end of the Middle Ages. So, from my point of view, this belongs in the same tradition as my medieval chronicles. And what we have here is really a delightful miniature book. It's tiny. A book from 15th century Italy. This is the kind of volume that I can imagine someone sitting reading under a tree. Around about the 15th century is when you get a new kind of painting coming in. I'm not an art historian and I'm not going to pretend to see anything knowledgeable there, but I do notice that from about that time you begin to get pictures of people sitting under trees reading. And this is a book that you can pack with your picnic. Well, maybe not. It's one of the classics that people studied. I can also imagine some teacher walking up and down in the classroom between the rows of the seats, reading slowly and pedantically, and then stopping to ask some poor boy to parse a form. I can imagine that as well. It would be fascinating, I think, to know, and I have no idea if anyone's ever researched, maybe you can tell me if anyone's ever done research on this, when did people start walking and reading at the same time? But looking at the physical forms of the books, I get the impression that it would be very difficult with the books that were printed, that were made in the earlier periods for most of them. Books of this size tend to be later. At any rate, this is a book that you could do that with. So there we have it, our chronicle as a single book, and that has its place, that has its function. Let's take a different type. A different type would be the inserted chronicle. And here we have a chronicle, by this I mean a chronicle that is inserted into something else. What I have here, BPL 114A, is in fact not a chronicle manuscript at all. This is a manuscript of martyrology. And I've given you over here the list of contents. It starts with Sigebert of Gembloux. Now, Sigebert actually wrote a very important chronicle, but this isn't it. This is something else by Sigebert. It's a poem on the Theban legion. As you all know, the Theban legion was a Roman legion in, I think, the 3rd century AD, which conveniently, poetically, consisted of 6,666 men. And they all heard the gospel and all at once converted to Christianity. They were commanded to convert back and refused, and all 6,666 of them went to a martyr's death, and were very much celebrated through the rest of the Middle Ages for this. So Sigebert has written a poem on this, and quite a substantial poem, followed by Eucherius, also wrote about the Theban legion. Then further down we've got a hymn on the martyrs, and then on the very last page, 65 verso, there is the title of a work by Marbord of Rennes on martyrs. Now that unfortunately is where the manuscript ends. Presumably it then went on with the text of Marbord, but those quires have been lost. The interesting thing is that right bang in the middle of this we have got a chunk of something which is not martyrology, which is actually history, the Historia Francorum of Gregory of Tours. And you can see why this is put in here. This gives you a little bit of background history against which the story of these martyrs can be read. And this inserted chronicle is doing a job. It is supporting everything else that the manuscript is doing, although the manuscript is not a manuscript of history as such. Inserted chronicle is not always supporting. Sometimes it can be pretty haphazard. This here is an 11th century Byzantine manuscript, and it actually contains a commentary on the Psalms. Now, it's a long work, and as you see, 311 pages in, the commentary on the Psalms ends. We've got two columns here. The left-hand column is the commentary on the Psalms. And you see how at the bottom of this, the text ends, and the scribe has very beautifully allowed the text to come together at a little point, visually showing, here I end. And he left the next column blank. On the right-hand page starts the next text. So there's a column that's blank. And later on, actually 400 years later on, another author decided to use that space to stick in a chronicle. And it's a 15th century chronicle, one of the Brachia Chronica, which is simply Greek for short chronicles. There are 102, I think, of these known Brachia Chronica, which are important for Byzantine studies. This is a chronicle, we know who wrote it, because he's writing about himself. It's an Istanbul merchant called Demetrius Leontares. And what he's actually written here is a family chronicle, a history of his family. Now, he owned several manuscripts, and he used the spaces in them to write down this chronicle. And he wrote it over, started here, and when he ran out of space, he got onto the next manuscript. The manuscripts then were dispersed. So if you want to get the end of this chronicle, you've got to go to Florence to a completely different manuscript, which on a spare page has the next bit of its next instalment. This is a random use of space, and of course this can happen. But my experience is that this is much less common than the planned insertion. The chronicle is inserted into a manuscript actually to do something. Here we have an incomplete text of the Hafenregister. Now this is a short Latin chronicle of the Counts of Holland from 860 through to 1121. It was written in Egmont in the second quarter of the 12th century, but with no manuscripts from the 12th century, or for that matter from the 13th or 14th. The earliest manuscript of this is from the 15th century, and that is in Haarlem, in the Regionalarchiv. It is the Egmont Cartulary. Now, a cartulary is a manuscript into which the monks of a monastery copied all their important documents. They might typically start with a foundation charter. They had been founded by somebody who wrote a piece of paper and founding this monastery, and that foundation charter gets copied in. And then there's maybe a letter from the king, which is of some importance, they copy it in. and then somebody gives them some land, and there's a piece of paper with a donation, they copy it in, so that all the documents of legal importance to the monastery are in one place. This is a cartulary, and all the big monasteries had them. And very frequently, you find a cartulary chronicle, which is a chronicle copied into the cartulary. Why is it there? Well, there's a very clear relationship, and this is another lecture which you might hear me give on a different occasion. But there is a whole relationship between law and history. What's our law based on? It's mostly based on precedent, and precedent is things that happened in the past. And where do you find things that have happened in the past? You find them in the history books. The relationship between history and law is extremely important for lawyers. So, cartularies have chronicles written into them. Now, unfortunately, the Leiden library doesn't give me a nice example of a cartulary chronicle, but this manuscript contains a whole series of documents copied out of the Egmont cartulary. So in a sense, it's kind of similar. It's got the same sequence of text, the legal text, and then the cartulary chronicle. The chronicle itself starts there at the bottom of the first column of the right-hand page. You'll see it's not really terribly clearly marked off. You can see that that's the start of something, but it doesn't look so much different from the start of the individual paragraphs of the text in front or after it. So there's no very obvious heading. It's optically integrated, and it's part of a whole unit. And this, the chronicle in the legal context, is an important type within the Middle Ages. Okay, that's the inserted chronicle. A different type would be the anthology of chronicles. Now, the word anthology is one that we don't normally use in this context. We might talk about modern people making an anthology of medieval literature, where you select your favourite poems and you print them in a book. That's an anthology. Why do we not refer to medieval manuscripts as anthologies? I think it's maybe because the word anthology implies careful selection, and we normally don't really credit medieval scribes with that careful selection, but we're wrong. I'm using the word deliberately because I think that they do. Okay, occasionally you get chaotic mixings of different texts within a manuscript, but usually when you find a group of chronicles in a manuscript, perhaps together with another group of texts, or perhaps not, usually there are reasons, thematic, contentual reasons for this this juxtaposition. This here is a 13th century chronicle manuscript from Normandy, and it's a very carefully produced collection. Have a look at the table of contents. It starts off with 3 works on Norman history. After all, it's written in Normandy, it's written for Normans. The first one is a very brief, anonymous work, and then we have the most important work of Norman history at the period, William of Jumièges, to get a Romano Dopo. This is followed by Robert de Torigny, who, of course, wrote a continuation of William, brought it up to date. Now, we're starting with the Normans. The Normans, of course, are ruling in England at this time, and over in England, they are trying very hard to produce a kind of identity which allows England to see itself as Norman. And so you are getting chronicles written in England at that time, which are merging old British history and the Norman regime. And one of the most controversial, innovative works at that time of Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, in which Geoffrey invents an entire pre-Norman and in fact pre-Anglo-Saxon history for England. And before even the Anglo-Saxons came, there were the ancient Britons. What was their history? And he's got the whole story of Arthur, and going back before Arthur, all the way back to the mythological root. This was a phenomenally influential work, and throughout the subsequent 4 or 5 centuries, there's a whole genre of chronicles which take motifs from Geoffrey as their basis. So, after Normandy, we move across to England. And since we've got Arthur here in the Arthurian material, we're going to stick in a little bit of Merlin. Good. Now we'll look at the continent. We've got Einhardt's History of Charles the Great. Then we've got 4 works on France. The Geta Regum Francorum, 2 works which are not historical, they're legal texts relevant to France, and then a list of French kings. And then we're back to Germany, if you like, for an account of the foundation of Aachen and for a song against the Saxons. This is not the Anglo-Saxons, this is Saxons and Franks competing in Germany. So it looks like we're bouncing from Germany to France, back to Germany. Actually not so. The thing to remember is, of course, Aachen and Charles the Great, they represent the Frankish kingdom. And at that time, French history understands French as being the succession of the Frankish kingdom. So the fact that modern, from their point of view, modern French history comes sandwiched, if you like, between the history of the older Franks is very, very logical. Good. Now we've dealt with the whole of Western Europe, or at least Northwestern Europe. Where are we going to go next? And we've got 2 texts which, both in different ways, are the travellers' books, if you like. These are 2 authors who both travelled to the east, to Mongolia, and wrote the history of the far distant eastern peoples. And these, at the time when this manuscript was produced, were among the most interesting new insights from the east. And then the whole thing is finished up with Ethicus Ister, a very strange book, an early medieval book, and actually it's a geography book. It's a geography of the whole of Europe, but with little bits of history in it as well. And it is, to my mind, a kind of a uniting of all these areas that we've looked at. We're now seeing them within a geographical continuum. Here you can see where Robert ends and Geoffrey begins. You can see it's a beautifully written manuscript, and in this case, very clear divisions between one work and the next. This is an anthology which is really quite thoughtfully put together. One more example, I'll do this a little bit more quickly. Here we have a pocketbook anthology, a nice little one, VLO 91. Pretty binding, of course, but the binding is not original. This is an anthology from Spain, from 13th century Spain. And if you look at the table of contents, you're going to see that one name appears twice in it, and that is Pelayo of Oviedo. And he is the key to understanding this anthology. Pelayo was 12th century bishop of Oviedo, which of course was the capital of the kingdom of Asturian Leon. Today it's on the north coast of Spain. And Pelayo was a bit of a local hero, because as bishop he had defended his see, and he had been important in the rise to power of that city within the kingdom and of that kingdom within the peninsula. Now Pelayo wrote several works himself, and 2 of them are in this manuscript. But what he also did towards the end of his life was he copied some of his own works together with some works by others, and these are known as the Corpus Pelagianum, which is found in its more original form in a manuscript in Madrid. So what I've got marked here in the with the brackets, with one exception, is the Corpus Pelayo, the Corpus Pelagianum. Starts, of course, with Pelayo himself on Italian cities. Then, we'll skip one, I'll explain in a minute. Then it goes on with an excerpt from Isidore. We've got the Chronicle of Alfonso III, who was one of the kings precisely in that city of Oleayo, and he wrote his own Chronicle of Leon. Then we've got Sampiro. Sampiro was a predecessor of Pelayo and one of Pelayo's heroes. And then Pelayo's own Chronicle at the end. And I think he saw his Chronicle as a continuation of these other texts, and then after that there's a continuation of Pelayo. So all of that is within the brackets. That's a corpus that was already a gathered anthology in the manuscripts before this one. It was copied in here and more was added. The Chronicle Albidense, another Spanish chronicle, was stuck in the middle. That's not part of Pelayo's scheme. And at the beginning, we've got some other works. The Provinciale is just a list of Spanish cities. The Annales Complutenses is quite an important short chronicle, and incidentally, this is the only manuscript that has survived. We only know this from this one manuscript. And another fairly minor set of monastic annals. And then down at the end, with a couple of legal texts again, and another chronicle. A Chronicle Iriense, which normally is transmitted together with the Historia Compostelana. It's unusual to have it by itself, so it's been taken out of the context it would normally be in by somebody who wanted it in here. And here you can see 7 lines up from the bottom. The line of red ink there is the start of the Annales Complutenses. Very colourful little manuscript. Themed anthologies then, I think, are the norm. And just looking around the manuscripts in Leiden, here's a whole lot more which you can look at and find out if you want. We've got an anthology of classical historians, an anthology of British and Norman chronicles, an anthology of Crusade chronicles, an anthology of Dutch chronicles, an anthology of chronicles of the city of Utrecht, anthology of French chronicles. And VLF 103 is interesting. It combines a collection of great lives, you know, the Virum Illustrium kind of works, with chronicles. My fourth and last type that I want to look at today is the work in progress. These are my favourite ones. We tend to assume that a text, once it's been written, is static, and to some extent that's true of most of the manuscripts that we've looked at. Actually, though, chronicles are most interesting when they are in constant development. In some cases, though, you have to peel back the layers, a bit like an archaeological dig, to find the stages of production. My daughters love the Disney cartoon Shrek. Have you seen it? And my favourite scene, I've had to watch this, I was forced to watch this many times, and my favourite scene has Shrek walking through a field, donkey by his side, and he's trying to explain the hidden depths of ogres. And he says, ogres are like onions, and I think if there's any one line from that film that I've taken away with me, it's that ogres are like onions. Not because, as the donkey thinks, they're brown and stink and make you cry, but because they have layers. Well, this manuscript is a bit of an ogre because the ravages of time have left it rather ugly. You can see it's been in a fire and the pages seem to have shrunk. But it has a heart of gold, and above all, it has layers. This is an 11th century manuscript, and here I have to acknowledge some wonderful help from Eric Chronicle, because it's in the catalogues as a 10th century manuscript, and thanks to his way of analysing the writing, he's able to tell me that no, in fact it is the last quarter of the 11th. And it's a chronicle manuscript. Well, sort of. It begins with a martyrology, necrologia. It was made in the Abbey at Fulda, and what this first text is, it's a list of short biographies of monks who lived and died in Fulda. It's followed by a chronological table and verses of the calendar, these chronological apparatus which are typical in chronicle manuscripts. Then a table of years. This is a table of the cycle, which can be used for calculating Easter. The cycles of Dionysius and Cyril of Alexandria, also useful for calculating Easter. A couple of prayers thrown in for good measure, and then some more chronological tables after that. The interesting thing is that these are written, as you already saw from the picture I already showed you, these are written in such a way that a lot of space is left on the page. 100 years later, somebody else came and decided to use that space by writing in a whole lot more works, which are also historical works. So here we have the 12th century development. Now this is too simplistic. Actually, there are several different 12th century hands, and given time, I would like to try to analyse exactly what comes in what order. The layers are much more complicated than I'm suggesting here. But this 12th century development adds names of emperors, popes, and martyrs. It adds a set of annals, which we can think of as monastic annals. It adds a letter, which was taken from Marianus Scotus, and then excerpts from Marianus Scotus himself. Marianus is one of the most important chroniclers of his period. Then we've got the Liber Pontificalis, a chronicle of popes, which was also tremendously influential. And that's followed by a list of popes, to which, I think later, a list of abbots has been added in parallel, and then a sermon fragment at the end. Let's look at what this actually looks like on the physical page. Here we have, for example, the table of years. The 11th century hand has written out this table of years, and then 12th century hand, parallel to that, has written in events that happened in those years. And so the annals begin to develop between the pages of the table. Or here. Here we have the 11th century hand. Comes to the end of the prayers. I said there were some prayers included. They begin the page before. They come down to the last quarter of that page. The bottom is left open. The next thing that the scribe wants to do is to put in chronological tables. But these are big tables that need a double page, so he can't put them here. But what he can do is write his introductory paragraph. So that appears up there. And then over the page, the chronological tables begin, which means that more than half of that page is left blank. In the 12th century, somebody else has come along, and he started on the page before with a letter from which he took from Marianus. It ends down halfway down that space at the bottom. Then down there over the page and onto the next page is his text from Marianus Scotus. Or here at the end of the Liber Pontificalis, the end of the Book of Popes, we've got a list of popes, and parallel to that a list of abbots. And if you look at these, you can see that these were also written in phases. This is not just about saving space, the way that the Byzantine Chronicle was. It's partly that. But the point is that the later edition is also Chronicles. It's parallel to what the earlier work was doing. This is a case of a program being developed. It's a case of readers using a book and continuing to expand it. I want to move on, and I'm going to finish fairly soon, but I want to move on into a slightly more modern period. And here we have a book by Peter de la Cour. Peter will certainly be familiar to all of you as an important figure in Dutch history. He was born here in Leiden in 1618 to a family of wealthy cloth traders. He studied in Leiden, and he went on to become an important political figure. And he was staunchly Republican, and as such he worked together with John de Witt. John de Witt apparently worked with him on his most important political tract, the Interest van Holland. So when Peter comes to writing history, you can bet that this is history with an agenda. You know that before you even start looking at it. And his history book is called the Historie der Grafelijke Regering in Holland. It's a very obvious example of agenda-driven history. In the preface, it talks about die onrechtvaardige usurpatien der Grafen. And he explains that this unjustified usurpation of power by the Grafs is a key to understanding Dutch history. And he criticises previous chroniclers for not having noticed that fact. Good, that's the book. He wrote it, he published it. The interesting thing for me is what happened next. Because after it was published, he took a copy and he took it apart, sliced it apart, took out the pages and glued them into a manuscript. Now they were glued into the manuscript before anything was written into the manuscript. And then he started writing on the pages round about them. And this manuscript has Peter's own hand, adding comments to the book that he has already written. Now, I have to say, I am not far enough on, you can see same page but with the printed page turned back. I'm not far enough on with this that I can really say what he was doing with this. He did later write a history of the stadtholders, whom he didn't like very much more than he liked the Graaf. Maybe it's preparatory for that, maybe it's preparatory for something else. That still has to be researched. I haven't done it yet. But you can see, here we have a lovely example of a manuscript where somebody is taking his ideas and he's continuing to develop them and to build on them. My very last example today, and this really has been a whistle-stop tour of many manuscripts, but this is one which I have grown to love over the last 6 months. Luponak's Eleander Ubinger. This is a man who obviously had quite a strong awareness of his own identity because he wrote his name 6 times into this manuscript. The strange thing is that the name is not to be found anywhere else. As far as I can find, and I've been searching since the autumn, as far as I can find, there are no historical records of this man. There are no other manuscripts of him or by him. There's nothing printed by him, nothing printed about him. I can't find him in histories of Holland, but he obviously lived in the Netherlands in the 16th century. I feel that there's more to be found about this, and I'm still looking. But all that so far I actually know about him is that he lived or came from Weener on the German-Dutch border, because that also is a detail that he writes 6 times in the manuscript. Now, on the front page, he promises us, you can see it here, he promises us a 5-part, 5-volume history of everything. Well, he only got around to doing the first volume as far as we know, or maybe the other 4 are lost, but what we have in this enormous volume is volume 1 of his plan. And his aim with this first volume is quite simply to get the chronology worked out. Now, this is a complicated thing, and you can see here it obviously was complicated because this is very scrappy. You see what we have here is a bit of paper that's stuck in after he's written on these pages. He needed more space, he stuck that in. Over on the other side there's a smaller piece of paper stuck in. All over the place there are things scored out. It's really rather messy. We can forgive him that. He's thinking and writing, and my notes are a lot more messy. But what he's doing here in this first section of the volume, he's discussing a problem, a basic problem in history in the later Middle Ages. They wanted really, ideally, they wanted to work with dates anno mundi. You start with creation of world, God, the creation of the world by God, that is year 1, and we count from there. The trouble is, it's kind of difficult to know how many years the Old Testament history took. So what year are we in? Anno Domini is a little bit clearer. It maybe has its own problems, but it's a little bit clearer. By the later Middle Ages, people were using Anno Domini, but historians wanted to be working Anno Mundi, and they wanted to convert. Now, as I say, it's kind of problematic because it depends what year of the world you think Jesus was born in. According to Eusebius and Jerome's translation of Eusebius, which is based on the Septuagint, Jesus was born in 5198 AM, Anno Mundi. However, over in England, Bede, who was one of the most influential figures here, came up with a different date. He said, no, Jesus was born in 3952. At the same time, there's a system that's also based on the Septuagint, but worked out by Julius Africanus, which has lovely, nice, round numbers. Jesus was born in the year 5500. And if you look at all the world chronicles across Europe, all of them are based on one of these 3 schemes, depending on which one of the 3 competing rival chronologies you actually believe in. Ubinger wanted to clarify this. So what he has done is he has made out a table, a conversion table. In the first column, we have Anno Mundi. In the third column, we have Anno Domini. And these are the important two columns. You can convert back and forward to one and just find the date you want, read across, and you'll get the date in the other sheet. Just for fun, he said, well, let's try some others as well. So the second column, for example, is Anno Diluviae, the year after Noah's Ark. Why? Nobody in medieval Chronicle tradition ever calculated from Noah's Ark. This is just Ubinger having some fun. He said, well, let's suppose that we calculate from then. Well, suppose we start, and he's got 11 columns. 2 of them are important, and the other 9 are just him playing. What happens if we count the year 1 is the beginning of the papacy? The year 1 is the beginning of the Roman Empire, etc. I'm really rather surprised that he doesn't also have a column dating from his own birthday and Anno Ubinger, because it sounded like the kind of thing he might do. But anyway, he's created this table, and as you can see on the page, we only have 40 years. It takes an amazing number of pages, a great big fat volume, to get from the beginning of the world right through until the end of the 6th millennium. But that's what he does, not once, but 3 times. He does the entire table 3 times, depending on which of the 3 traditional ways of counting Anno Mundi you're going to base it on. So here we have the ultimate conversion table for possible dating systems. And into the space between the lines, he's also written events, so it becomes a little bit of a set of annals as well. We can tell probably when he was writing, because the last event that he mentions down there is the coronation of Pope Pius V, which was in 1566. So that's probably when he finished his work on this. But he was keen not to stop there. He wanted to be able to convert future dates as well. And so it goes on into his future. It goes on hundreds of years into his future. In fact, it goes on to the year 6000, Anno Mundi, which he doesn't exactly say, but he sort of implies that's when the world ends. And when is it? Nervous? It's 2018. If the Maya don't get us, then Ubinger will. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed seeing some of the manuscripts that I've been looking at. I've had a lot of fun with them. What I've tried to highlight today, what all of these examples in different ways illustrate, is simply this. The physical pages of our chronicles are places where things happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you take any questions if there are any? Feel free, don't be shy. Well, I'm not surprised. This was a brilliant, memorable speech, very enjoyable. Thank you so much. On behalf of all of us, you'll be here, so if somebody thinks I do have a question, you'll be available. Let me give you this memento, which is a book on medieval history. It was out of our inventory, but since we do printing on demand, we can promise each other that if you publish with Brill, we'll keep you in print.
Thank you very much.